small audience.
I hope it's worth the price of admission that you paid. More and more. Welcome to the regular meeting of the Rehoboth Beach Planning Commission. It's 1:30 p.m. on November 22nd. Mr. Secretary, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Stockdale is absent today. Commissioner Ellison.
Here.
Commissioner Davis will be absent today. Commissioner Stewart.
Here.
Commissioner Strange.
Here.
Commissioner Hunter.
Here.
Myself, Commissioner Dewey, Commissioner Gay,
Here.
and Commissioner Bryan.
Here. We have a quorum. Declare this meeting in order. Ms. Womack, would you tell us about the publication of notices, please?
The agenda was posted in City Hall and on the city portal on November 14th. That's all I have for that, and there's been no correspondence.
All right, thank you. We have a very brief agenda today. The first matter is the discussion of the proposed revisions of Chapter 236 and Chapter 270 of the City Code. I'd like to just make a very brief statement to open up the discussion. The city continues in its pursuit of two sets of ordinances which would amend the city's site plan review and zoning codes. A new set of ordinances would transfer exclusive authority from the Planning Commission to the city building inspector, who is a city employee, to interpret provisions of the city zoning code when reviewing all aspects of site plans for major commercial projects, including new hotels along the boardwalk. The city's proposed ordinances would allow the building inspector to meet with developers and their representatives behind closed doors with no public input prior to issuing decisions regarding whether major commercial projects are zoning code compliant. The current code provides for review and decisions by the Planning Commission in open meetings and hearings with public participation after public notice. The second set of ordinances proposed by the city would leave that authority with the Planning Commission, which has successfully exercised its duties without interference or controversy since the city code was amended in 2009. A joint meeting between the Planning Commission and the City Board of Commissioners is scheduled for January 23, 2025 to discuss this issue. The Planning Commission's role is to safeguard the integrity of planning decisions as the city moves forward on development matters and to see that the recommendations set forth in the Comprehensive Development Plan are followed. The public needs to ask why there is an impromptu movement afoot on the part of the city to remove these safeguards. A better course of action would be for the city to abandon its efforts to fundamentally change the authority of the Planning Commission and to maintain and continue the Planning Commission's review process, which has worked well for the past 15 years. The process of professional guidance in coordination with public sentiment is more vital than ever as we face the changing landscape of Rehoboth Beach. In short, this appears to be a solution looking for a problem. Thank you. Next.
Well, I guess I'm going to do the
Okay.
PowerPoint that was too long for the commissioners' meeting. It was more than 3 minutes, so I had to abandon it. I have the monitor. And let me go up here. And what I had assembled, and again, some of this was assembled before their meeting, is sort of a just look at where we are today, and some points that that dovetail with what Mike just said about the problems with the ordinances. And very brief timeline, because our revisions of Chapter 236 and the controversy over the building inspector are ones that have been around for a while now. The Planning Commission first tasked us with reviewing and amending Chapter 236 back in August of 2022, so more than 2 years ago. And actually,
Do you mean the Board of Commissioners?
What'd I
not
say?
The Planning Commission tasked us with?
we
we
Planning
were
Commission
tasked.
was tasked
Okay,
with, sorry,
okay,
it was,
got it.
yeah, it had to be short. The Planning Commission was tasked with evaluating and recommending amendments to the code, and it was actually driven by two things. One, in the CDP. There is a recommendation in the CDP that all oceanfront commercial properties are subject to site plan review, which they had not been, so that was by itself reason enough to revise. There had also been some issues with the Coast Hotel, as you all may remember, and whether or not their renovation was significant enough to have warranted site plan review. I think most people thought it was, but it wasn't done, so that part needed clarifying. So we looked at the whole chapter, and in February, the second bar there, in February 2023, we actually submitted recommendations to the city. But the then city manager, Lawrence Christian, wanted the city staff in Wallace Montgomery to weigh in. And by that summer, they had produced a document of their own revisions, but really it was a completely new document. There was nothing wrong with it. We liked some of their recommendations. It was just in a different format from our code. So when we met in September, I'm now on the fourth bar, the September 2023 meeting. When we met in September to review those changes, we thought, well, and we asked them, can you redline them against our changes? Well, no, because it was a completely new document. So we took many of Wallace Montgomery's suggestions and incorporated them into our revisions. So to sum up where we are, as of about a little over a year ago, no action was taken by the Board of Commissioners on our first recommendations, and there was no response on our second set of recommendations that included the Wallace Montgomery ones. But in a separate action, and I think this is one of the things I think is a little bit ironic here, in a separate action, the Board of Commissioners gave us additional authority last September over the lot mergers and separations and partitionings that had up to that point been an administrative building inspector decision. So we got those back for a number of reasons, not the least of which was keeping the records straight with the county. But essentially, the upshot was we needed a public process because of the legalities of those actions. So we got that back, even though they were started looking at other changes since then that would go in the other direction and give us less authority. So that's a little perplexing. Got more, now we're going back the other way. So finally in January is when we adopted our formal resolution with all of the new amendments, including the ones from Wallace Montgomery, built into the existing code. And it was, again, redlined against the existing code. And the upshot of this is nothing has happened since then, except for suddenly, out of the blue, the ordinances that came about over the summer, I guess, which gave the building inspector authority, and then the two ordinances that came forward for the commissioners to decide which way to go. But there's been no talk in the interim of any of the recommendations we had previously made, so we're sort of missing a few steps. So to that, I just also want to get, because I think some people think that this relates to, every decision the city makes, and it isn't. So I just wanted to give a brief review of site plan review, but also show just how much work we've been doing recently. As Chairman Bryan just said, it's been working well for 15 years. Site plan review went into the code in 2009. And to date, there have been 11 applications that have come before the Planning Commission. 6 have been approved, and 4 of those were in this calendar year. The 3 on Rehoboth Avenue and the Belhaven. So we've been doing a lot this year, as you'll see from the ones that's still in the works. They're still going on, and those are all 2024. Public hearing in January for 1 Rehoboth. Preliminary review in just 2 weeks for Atlantic Crown. And 1 currently in concept review that we heard yesterday for the Beachview Motel. So all those are currently ongoing. And of those 11 applications, 1 was tabled back in 2017, and that was Beach Walk. Went on for years, cost the city a lot of money. But the city prevailed at the Supreme Court level, and actually that project's coming back as a subdivision now. And then another plan, Clear Space, that was approved by the Planning Commission, but actually overturned by the commissioners, specifically on the issue of code compliance. So that's an overview of where site plan has been for the last 15 years. But before any thought is given to changing our authority, we must point out that lawsuits against the city costing taxpayers well over $1 million, and I'll be talking about some of the cases, have actually resulted from building inspector mistakes. That Planning Commission issues have been upheld in the courts. Obviously, the one was overturned by the commissioners, but been upheld in the courts. And the building inspector's decisions have been pointed out in in court opinions that their opinion is not the final. In addition to that, one of my colleagues here, Commissioner Strange, has done some research of over 80 municipalities, and we talk about that today, and none of them requires the Planning Commission to appeal to a Board of Adjustment. And also, none of them gives absolute power of over zoning code to the building inspector. So those are just some fast facts. But here are the cases, and these are all complex, I will say, and I'm going to try to make them very brief, but just in the interest of time here, but these are very complicated cases. Ocean Bay Mart went on for, 4 or 5 years, and it did cost the city over $700,000. And the plan, as many of you may remember, was to build homes in a condominium scheme, and the point of bringing this here, there were a number of points in the lawsuit, the developer, but the building inspector who was here in 2013 told them they could do it. So they, even though a subsequent building inspector ruled differently, and the case went to court because the Planning Commission said then it had to be subdivided. So a subsequent building inspector made the right call that you couldn't build that they could not build the condos. Nevertheless, the developer maintained all the way to the Supreme Court that very first determination by the building inspector gave them vested rights. They lost the case, the city won the case, but they maintained that all the way to the Supreme Court. So if the code is changed to give the building inspector authority, even if there's a change in the building inspector down the road, that first ruling could have meant that Beach Walk would have been built, and that we would have lost those cases. And the other thing that's interesting in terms of support here is that when the case went to the Supreme Court, the Delaware chapter of the American Planning Association and the Delaware League of Local Governments weighed in with an amicus brief that said a mistake of a building official does not create vested rights. Fortunately, the court agreed. And in the Chancery decision, the judge pointed out that the important parts here are in bold, that the building inspector makes an initial review, and then the Planning Commission is tasked with its own review. So that's in the court opinion. Next one, clear space. In this case, the city solicitor was defending the action of the Planning Commission because it was appealed by the citizens to the commissioners. But even he says as an initial matter, an initial determination is made by the building inspector, and it's a preliminary approval. And then he pointed out that the Planning Commission went okay. But even he termed the building inspector's role to be preliminary in that case. This was a doozy, and it did not involve the Planning Commission at all, but it is very indicative of the fallout of differences of opinion. And you'll remember this, Rick, you were there that night, I was there that night, I'll never forget it, in September of 2019, when it's actually the predecessor to the Atlantic Crown. It was called Baltimore Avenue Hotel generically at the time. And the building inspector had ruled that the balconies counted in FAR, which they do. But at the hearing, it was revealed, there's two different building inspectors, one for residential, one for commercial, that the residential building inspector had interpreted it differently. And the attorney for the project stood up here and showed pictures all over the city of houses that had been built with the balconies, with the decks and balconies not counting. So it came out at the meeting, they kind of looked at each other, the two buildings, went, oh, you do it that way? I do it that way. And it was really a bit of a shock. And as a result of that, the next day, a notice went up on the door of building and licensing that said, from here forward, all residential plans, because the Board of Adjustment sided with the commercial building inspector that said, yes, they count in FAR. So a notice went up the following day that hereforth all building plans and residential would be subject to that. And there were already projects in the works. There were people that were ready to submit their plans, and all of a sudden. So that led to, first of all, it led to a couple of lawsuits. One wasn't continued, and one was. And actually, I think the city lost the Lingo case. But more importantly, it led to code changes that clarified gross floor area and now has removed any ambiguity, because now the code lists. I was involved in that. It took about, I would say it took the better part of 2 years to get those code changes made. But over the course of the 2 years, we found a way to spell out very specifically what counts, so that hopefully that mistake won't be made anymore. But it's an example of two different people in the same department making a different determination and the fallout that can occur as a result of that. Again, this didn't involve the Planning Commission at all, but it's indicative of the scope of the issue. And then going back many years, to the Packham case is actually what is now the Brighton Suites Hotel. And it led to that case, I believe, is what led to the clarification in the code that hotels have to have 50% lot coverage. Because at the time, the building inspector had said, well, it's a commercial project, I guess they can go 100%, and so the hotel is 100%. And I think it was built before this case, so it was obviously not unbuilt. But the judge at the time ruled that there was no reason to give the opinion of the building inspector great weight. And in addition, that the building inspector is in no better position to determine the intent than this court. And again, as a result of that, the code was clarified that the hotel portion of a commercial project cannot do 100% lot coverage, and that's directly as a result of that case. And I think the next thing I want to talk about is some sort of, I won't call it misinformation, I just think it's a misperception out there of the scope of what we do and the scope of the problem. Because again, as Chairman Bryan says, we don't really have a problem. So I thought it was humorous, this cartoon in the Cape Gazette, you all may have seen it a couple of weeks ago, that sort of highlights this controversy we're going through with all the marking off of the building permit. But here's the thing. The Planning Commission does not approve building permits. Never has. I don't think we ever should. The building inspector has the full authority, based on our site plan approval and conditions, over approving the building permits. We don't even see construction drawings. In fact, the drawings that we see during site plan review have a stamp on them, not for construction, because construction drawings are much more detailed and have more information in them. I'll also point out that Matt once showed me, and it's a great visual because I remember him demonstrating with his hand, it told me about the differences between, zoning code and building code. He said, the zoning code is like this, a little book like this. He said, the building code is like this. So once the plans go in, there are thousands of variables that the building inspector and the building inspector alone makes a determination on. That's fine. Site plan review is only for the major projects that meet the criteria that's in the code. And sure, we have more of them today than we had when site plan review was first instituted, but it's a small number of the total plans that go through the department. It's the ones with the biggest impact on the city. It's a public process, whereas building permit approval is not a public process. So I feel like there's checks and balances here. You got the public process that assures the overall plan meets code, appropriate for the city, then the building inspector gets to deal with everything beyond that. So here we're set up for a joint, finally, after about a year since we submitted the revisions, we're having a joint meeting with the Board of Commissioners in January. And I'm bothered by something in preparation for that meeting, and I'm hoping we can get some resolution on it between now and then, and that is, it's a public discussion between two public bodies. All support materials that have been made available to both bodies and to the public should be available, before that meeting. As it stands right now, we have submitted a number of items to the city. Not only our recommendations for code change, but we received a waiver from our then attorney, Luke Mehta, to give them an attorney-client privilege memo that details the cases behind our recommendations, and also the information on this review of other municipalities that have been done. We understand that the city may have materials that go another way, and I feel like it is only right that we should see those in advance. But no documents in response have been shared with us or with the public. So we're really kind of clueless as to what's behind this and what's the right way to go, both from a legal as well as a practical perspective. We are lacking information. And of course, the one elephant in the room during this whole process has been that everybody says that the code is a mess and needs to be fixed. And I don't disagree with that because it hasn't been updated in 50 years, but it's been changed a lot. So there, like this gross floor area, change that was made a few years ago. So it's been band-aided over the years, and that's not ideal. So CDPs going back 15 years have called for revisions. But to give authority to one person interpreting an outdated code is definitely the wrong approach if the code itself is part of the problem. That leaves things very much into one person's determination without good reason. And for now, during the 15 years that the site plan review process has been working, should be allowed to continue the way it is. And I will also point to yesterday. I thought yesterday was great. I thought it was extremely productive. We handled 3 cases in less than 2.5 hours, moving all of them forward. And that's the way it ought to be. And I look forward to more of those forthcoming, because I know we have some forthcoming. And I guess the only other thing I'll say is, and certainly the chairman alluded to this, that any change in the code that takes power away from a public body and transfers it to a single office in the city to be done behind closed doors is not in the city's best interest. But in addition to that, the appeals process that is stated there, which calls for the Planning Commission to appeal to the Board of Adjustment if there's any disagreement, would put projects on hold for months and would cost the city taxpayers thousands of dollars. And the bottom line is there aren't many disagreements. These are few and far between. So that's the part that's a problem, that's a solution looking for a problem, because we don't have these with every project. And we should not throw out a process that's been working because of a couple of small problems. That's my background.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Next.
I'll go next. Susan, never mind, I was going to ask you to keep that up there. So I wanted to dispel a narrative and a notion that's taken hold that the Planning Commission was seeking to seize power where it had none. So the code in place since the vote in 2009, Section 236-30, talks about site plan. And I'm going to quote pieces and leave it out because it's a long paragraph. But it said, the lead-in is no building permit shall be issued for any projects or projects that individually or collectively, and then it lays out the size and scale of those that are required to come through site plan. That paragraph ends by saying, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Site plan until, okay. No building permit shall be issued for these projects until a site plan has been reviewed and finally approved for such project by the Planning Commission. Now, I don't know how people think that's ambiguous. Then goes on further to state, among the many things that this commission should think about and consider when looking at site plans, among them is the opinion of city staff and the building inspector. Now, again, if you take those two in conclusion, if we may consider, that doesn't mean we have to or that we're bound by it. So I'm of the opinion that the problem arose for a couple reasons. I don't think this commission made this any better by going to the Board of Commissioners and trying to change language, which in my opinion was already clear. I think we went to the Board of Commissioners and our lawyer read code for an hour and a half and put everybody to sleep and about where commas go, and that was not a very productive way to persuade people. So I think we have to bear our responsibility for sort of doing that. But can trace this specific, the arc of this, to a combination of things that happened in the summer of 2023. In June of '23, the building inspector, on an applicant for site plan review, an application for site plan review, the building inspector sent correspondence directly to an applicant taking a position that was contrary to the position of several people on this body. That was unusual for a couple reasons. One, it cited legal cases. It looks like a legal brief. It's sort of different in character than other correspondences we've seen from the building inspector. I believe, but I haven't, gotten testimony. It was pretty clear it was drafted by a lawyer. Signed by Matt Janis, taking a position contrary. Following that, in the hearing of July of '23, and I commend people to watch the first 15 minutes, we're trying to ask the building inspector the basis of his opinions on things, help inform our decision, learn where we might make changes. The former city solicitor acted as if he were representing a hostile witness to this body, and ended by saying he believes the building inspector has authority. And after that time, that applicant's lawyer quoted the former city solicitor. Anytime there was a dispute, well, we had a meeting with the building inspector, with the former city, and they said we could do this and that. So I don't know why a city solicitor would have done that if he had the interests of, the city at heart, because that would have been a good discussion to resolve in private. Nonetheless, that then escalated. The communication from the Board of Commissioners dissipated to nothing. And then these two ordinances were put on an agenda the same day 2 new commissioners were sworn in. So it has left us wondering. The timing is suspect. What's the rush? What's going on? This has worked well. I think the narrative that this body is anti-development or whatever is wrong. I think all of us take seriously our duties as we understand them is that we don't have discretion. We have to apply the code. And my feeling personally is I love to see the city rejuvenated and redeveloped consistent with the CDP. But if there are things that if the city wants whatever the Board of Commissioners wants and they put it into the code, that's what I'm judging to. And I think everyone on this commission works really hard, and it doesn't necessarily serve the city well to have this sort of, characterization that we don't want to do things. And I think the speed with which applications move through our system has to also do with the character of the project and the sort of approach of the applicant. That's it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Ms. Hunter.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in my mind, really, you can reduce this pretty much concocted problem to 3 questions. One is the law unclear now, or has the current process somehow messed up or delayed applications? And I think you can tell from the presentation by Commissioner Gay that the answer to that is no. I think we've had criticism from one applicant. And that is the basis for the concoction of this issue. The second question is, even if the law currently is clear, and it works pretty well, and in fact, it's worked for almost 15 years pretty well, maybe we're out of step with other communities. So my co-commissioner, Commissioner Strange, as Commissioner Gay indicated, did an enormous amount of research and investigated 80 other jurisdictions. And there is no jurisdiction where a public body the Planning Commission is bound by the decision of one city employee, the building inspector, whose decisions have proven to be incorrect time and time and time again. Just doesn't exist. So even if the law is clear, even if it's worked well for almost 15 years, are we somehow out of step? Answer, no. And in fact, if you look at the contents of our code, as Commissioner Gay has presented in the past, we are the most liberal of coastal towns in allowing development and allowing buildings. So no, we're not out of step. So what's the third question? Assuming that the answers to the first two are no. The third question is, well, even if it hasn't caused any problems, and normally if something isn't broke, you don't try to fix it. And even if we're not out of step, and some, sort of overbroad statements have been made that other jurisdictions have a different approach. Well, they may have a different approach. I mean, they may have an entirely different composition of bodies, but there's no jurisdiction where the building inspector, for which the qualifications are that the individual must have a high school education and be familiar with construction and carpentry. And I'm not suggesting that our building inspector has only those qualifications, but that is the requirement of the building inspector. So there's no other jurisdiction where that individual who is not subject to public review except for this body has the last word. Okay, so what is in the best interest of the public? What division of authority is in the best interest of the public? That should be the question. I mean, there are other questions about other parts of the building code, but that should be the question about this part of the building code. And what is at stake is public transparency, public input, and public accountability. And in the example of several applications, we have seen situations where the behind closed doors meeting of the building inspector with applicants has led the applicant to believe that he, she, it has received approval when there's been no public input, no public sharing of the plans, and so forth. Now, as long as that it's unfortunate for the applicant, and we've had some applicants go before one board or another relying on the impression given by a city employee, and those applicants have had to be disabused of that perception. And probably most famously in the case that Commissioner Gay described. But what's at stake is whether when the proposal is for something that requires site plan review, which means it has to be big. It means that it's not somebody's house, and it's not even a small commercial renovation. It's a big project. Those projects should be subject to public review and public input. They should be subject to testimony from people like the owners of adjacent buildings who, for example, with the Belhaven project, came and testified again and again and again about the concerns they had about the structural damage to their property and their property interest. Those individuals had no way to participate in meetings held behind closed doors with the building inspector. The only way that information got to the public, and the only way it got reflected in the conditions that we placed on, for example, the Belhaven application, was because we had public hearings, and we had public discussions, and because our decision governed. That's the way it is, and that is the way it should be. And so if the city decides there are a number of points with regard to the zoning code that it would make sense for the Planning Commission and the Board of Commissioners to collaborate on and to figure out ways that could be updated and modernized. And as Commissioner Stewart pointed out, if the Board of Commissioners wants to amend the city code to allow, I don't know, higher height limits, higher limits for height, or bigger projects, or more density, that's up to the Board of Commissioners. They can take a public vote, and then they can run for re-election. And that is basically, the sort of ultimate control. But the principles that are established, that have been established in our zoning code, are the ones that we are enforcing and the ones that we will continue to enforce. And we will continue to take the recommendations of the building inspector, which on the form says preliminary approval, and consider those and give them, weight and also question them. And that is exactly what we should do. And that is exactly what the public should demand. Because if that is changed with a Board of Commission change in the law, then what you have essentially is what I would call the AAA result, which is the Anti-Accountability Act. And this town should not have an Anti-Accountability Act. If anything, there should be more accountability, not less, in city government. So that's my perspective, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Next. Commissioner Dewey.
As the process that's been described, and Commissioner Gay did a really nice job outlining what the timeline has been, and also Commissioner Stewart's perspective on how we seem to have got to this place. Each of these very large projects that comes forward, the bottom of the building inspector report, and I won't quote it exactly, so forgive not being able to repeat the precise language, but it makes it clear that the building inspector's determinations are not final. That closing statement makes it clear that it has to come before this body for the full public vetting and review process, as well as the varying expertise that will benefit from members of the commission. That language was put in place by the same attorney who then says, no, that's not how it's supposed to be. So I'm getting a little bit of whiplash trying to understand how something so key and so important to the functioning of this body was okay and blessed by that particular attorney, and then suddenly that person has changed their mind. I always get concerned, and my career was in a public environment. I always got very concerned when a public official's position would change radically. This wasn't a tweak. This was a 180. So that's the level of my concern around this. I will restate some things that others have already put out there much better than I can possibly do. But to best capture that would be to return to some of the issues that were brought up around the Belhaven project. There was testimony provided by members of the public that was highly technical in nature that otherwise would not have been available to the members of this body. The building inspector has, by code, minimal qualifications, age 18, high school diploma. All of our building inspectors have had way broader knowledge and information. So it's not to reflect or to criticize any individual or group of individuals. But these huge hotels that are being built in very fragile environments bring with them a whole host of unanticipated technical issues that it would be completely unreasonable to expect one individual or even a department of skilled people to capture everything, including with the knowledge being provided by the outside consultant. It's an unreasonable ask. And it's only through engaging with members of the public that I believe that we will be able to address fully those concerns. And it has to be done in the light of day. It's got to occur in a public meeting. So I will just close quickly by summarizing that the current code language that is quite clear and outlines the responsibilities of the Planning Commission in this narrow aspect of these large site plan reviews has been key to protecting the interests of the citizens, and I would also argue, if done in good faith, protects the interests of the developers as it has assisted to identifying issues that were then able to be resolved as a part of this planning process. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ellison.
Just briefly, I'm looking at the other side of this, and I realize that the two proposals, the ordinances that were put before the Board of Commissioners, came to them without a single justification, not a single argument for making the change, and certainly without a single expression of how this change, to give the building inspector the final authority, how that would improve the city's handling of site plan reviews and related issues. And of course, all of you have expressed the notion of public awareness, public involvement in the process as it is currently carried out. So I just, to me, it makes no sense unless, somehow those justifications come forward. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Strange, how are you, sir?
And yes, I will speak into the microphone. I probably should have put a PowerPoint together, but I didn't. And I would start off just by asking one question is, I had submitted a brief, the research paper that people have referred to, that does exist in the records of the Board of Commissioners, but I think I probably should resubmit it so it's in the public record of this meeting, because I think it's substantial, it's significant, it's obviously far more independent research than was carried out by the whoever the hell did it, that the commissioners came up with their proposal. And I guess what I would do is, as I would say, it was essentially an academic analysis. It's based on the philosophy of what's called a falsifiable proposition. What that means is it's something that you can research, that you can analyze, that you can look at the data, and from that draw a conclusion that is valid based on science. It's not based on your personal opinion. It's not based on your personal perspective. It's essentially the scientific method, which in fact is what we do as a body. And to go one step further, as a collective body, as opposed to a single building inspector, this approach that we have is called the Del.C technique, which people may not realize that's what this structure is academically. And it comes from the Oracle of Delphi, from Greek mythology, who had the ability to foresee the future. Well, we don't have the ability to foresee the future, but we do have the ability to analyze the present, look at the history, and see how that would evolve going into the future. And one of the elements of that is having a diversity of people on this committee. And in fact, it's preferable to have a significant diversity. We have business people, architects, engineers, planners, and their perspective is different. And that's what's important, to come up with a collective decision that's for the betterment of everybody. And we also do it for free, which is, I think, something's very important from the standpoint of the fact that there literally, if we added up the amount of hours that we put in as a committee, it would probably exceed a few $1 million a year based on our professional rates, at least for those of us before I retired. In the past year, I spent over 400 hours doing analysis of the various proposals that came before us. And when I retired in 1998, unfortunately due to an accident that almost killed me, my professional rate was $200 an hour in 1998. I don't know what it would be today if I still practiced, but I can assure you it'd be more than that. So the result would be the city got all of that knowledge, all of that service for zero cost. And I do it willingly for the public on their behalf, because I do have that knowledge. Okay, so much for that. The research paper that I did was in a typical research fashion, where I stated a hypothesis. And the hypothesis was, is the proposed change in the building inspector and the PC administrative regulations under 270-82 of the Building and Zoning Code a positive improvement for public policy in Rehoboth Beach? In other words, is it better than what you have? Is it significantly better? Is it significantly worse? Now, there's a multitude of techniques that you can undertake to try to establish, is that true or false? Or to what degree is it true or false? And the way that I selected was to, okay, it seems to me we should probably look at other jurisdictions and see what they do, not just in our backyard, but around the country. Well, there's 36,000 jurisdictions that have building inspectors and have planning commissions and have a structure for evaluating properties. So then the next question is, well, geez, I don't have much time to prepare for the meeting to evaluate all 36,000. So what I did was I applied statistics to come up with what was the minimum number you could do for a reasonable, in this case, 90% degree of confidence that your observation would be correct. And the observation was going to be, is this a positive improvement for the city of Rehoboth Beach? And the research on a comparative basis to more than 80 municipalities was a definitive absolutely not. And what was so startling, there were several things that I discovered when I did the research, which was kind of amazing. In those that I analyzed, none of them had the Planning Commission go to the Board of Adjustment if there was a disagreement. And in fact, in several jurisdictions, the Planning Commission was the Board of Adjustment, which I found startling because I wasn't familiar with that, and had I not done this research, I wouldn't have discovered that. I'm not recommending that. But there are jurisdictions that are set up that way, larger and smaller than we are. One of the difficulties, as was pointed out earlier, with regard to the qualifications of the building inspector in our own jurisdiction, is our description is hopelessly out of date. And it was accurate if it was 1939, but it isn't 1939. Plus the fact one of the best building inspectors we had in recent history was a woman and not a man. And unfortunately, our building code says it has to be a man. That's one of the problems, among others. It relates to that. So back to the falsifiable proposition. When you look at the 36,000 municipalities, it's very, very fascinating when you do that. And I think the part that's being missed is, and hasn't really been appreciated, is you can make a very tiny change to rules and regulations or standards that may not seem important at the time. But as time evolves, it can turn out to be one of those situations where you look at it and you say, oh my God, what did we do? We never thought about what would happen. Now, it's interesting from a purely analytical and engineering perspective. For small-scale projects, for those things which the building inspector has complete authority over right now, you can build something that's 100% to code and be absolutely the most unsafe structure you could have. but you meet the code. But it can be unsafe. Now, that's an anomalous situation, and nobody in their right mind is going to do that. But by accident, it could happen. And it has in other jurisdictions, where something was built to meet the code and then it failed. You want to avoid that. Now, we don't see things that currently meet certain criteria that are totally under the jurisdiction of the building inspector, and that's just fine. Because the building inspector hopefully has the qualifications, that he or she has the knowledge to say, gee, I'm not sure about that, and even though I looked at the International Building Code, it seems to be okay, I'm going to have our consultants in a particular specialty look at it with greater detail, whether it's a mechanical engineer or a civil engineer or an electrical engineer. The reference was made earlier to the International Building Code, and I think, Susan, you did, I forget, and said, you know, the code is like this thick, and when you take all the other references in the IBC, it's really this thick. Well, in reality, and as several people in this room will be aware, when you look at all of the extensions of all the code, of all the standards that under the International Building Code, under the American Society of Civil Engineering, the American Society of Professional Engineers, which I'm a member of, the International Electrical and Electronic Engineers, it could fill this room. No one's capable of knowing all of those, even though we may try our best to try to. It really ends up becoming as you stepwise go through the analysis and you look at it, you keep seeking further and further detail to make sure that you're right in your decision. And that's a very heavy responsibility. You don't want to be capricious in your decisions. You want to analyze them and know the engineering data is correct. Now, I should point out, and it's been pointed out several times here, and it's very, very important, there are so many decisions that the public never sees that the building inspector handles personally, he or she. And you only know that something happened after you see it being built. I have firsthand knowledge because going back several years ago, probably 15 years ago, there was a building being built, and I looked at it, and I said, something's very wrong with this. And I made application to the building inspector and said, there seems to be something wrong with this. Are you aware of that? And they went out and they rechecked. Well, it turns out the building inspector made a mistake. The surveyor made a mistake. Neither of them were correct. And the result was the building ended up being 3 feet taller than it was supposed to be. They then sought a variance. It was rejected. And it was rejected because the 3 feet involved, although it would require the person who built it to reduce the size of it, it would have not been in compliance with the CDP. It would not have been in compliance with the character of the neighborhood. It was wrong on several dimensions. And so the Board of Adjustment rejected it, and in fact, the builder readjusted it so it met the height requirement. Those kind of accidental things happen, and maybe if I hadn't passed it, it would have continued to be built and no one would know until after the fact. But luckily it was caught in the early stage of construction, so the amount of harm wasn't that great. What's difficult is, and there are other examples which have occurred in the last 12 years since I've been on the Planning Commission, where a particular developer lied to the building inspector, lied on the form to the building inspector. I just happened to go, as was my pattern, is to go look at the property in question to say, okay, they want to do X. What does it look like? Where is it at? And so I just drove by the property and I observed something that didn't comply with the form. I notified the attorney, the city attorney, I notified the building inspector, and I was informed that you're right. The applicant lied. They didn't say that. They said the applicant filled the form out incorrectly. The attorney for the applicant was notified. The attorney then notified the applicant and said, you've got to change the application. So the applicant changed the application. They then came before us because it was it was dividing a lot into two, and the applicant made certain representations. The representations were false. We didn't know that at the time. His attorney did not know that at the time. but his attorney was informed of that fact after the fact. It was still approved because, in fact, the particular parcel could be separated into two, but there were other extenuating circumstances where the applicant lied to the building inspector, lied to his attorney, and then lied to us continuously. And it wasn't picked up until after the fact. However, no harm was done from the physical perspective. However, that was a situation where, if just by accident, if I wasn't doing my due diligence, we wouldn't have picked up on that. In other previous cases before this board, which were approved by a previous building inspector that came before this committee, and at that time, the chair of the committee was a fellow engineer, which we both had a proclivity to examine the drawings in great detail, even though they were signed off by professional engineers. And this again involved a subdivision of land that had the length of the land off by 4 feet. Now, if you were an adjacent property owner and property was suddenly subdivided and they were going to build a house and they started to put construction signs up on 4 feet of your property, you would be rather upset. Now, that was signed off by a sealed, certified Delaware engineer. And the two people on the planning commission, I was one, and David was the other, was the chair at that point. We identified that. And the engineer who made the error said, "Oh, we used AutoCAD and we didn't check it." Well, you had an obligation to check it. When you put your seal on there, that said you were liable, that you knew these calculations were correct. That's the obligation that an engineer has. And he or she puts their reputation on the line when they do that. The attorney representing that applicant was not aware of it because it was an attorney. He was not an engineer. 2 engineers on this commission caught it. They corrected it, they resubmitted it, they readjusted it, and then it was approved. It's that type of activity that can occur that requires a larger group to analyze the data so you can come up with a valid conclusion. And so you might look at that and you say, well, gee, why do we vest so much into the building inspector to do the things that he does? Why does it have to reach a certain level? It's really one of practicality. Otherwise, you would have large groups of people meeting forever, spending all kinds of money to get us to meet, to approve projects. So what's taken, as is done in every other jurisdiction in the United States, although I would tell you the degree of authority of a building inspector is very variable around the country. That's one thing that was quite amazing. We're very liberal, quite frankly, but there's nothing wrong with that. We set certain criteria. There are certain jurisdictions in the United States where if it's not residential, the building inspector has zero authority to prove anything. Unless it's residential, every other commercial development has to be approved by a larger group. And the groups are various, and it has other dimensions beyond just the planning commission. There are other commissions involved, particularly in those jurisdictions which have although we have the ocean, and I would argue that's a very big environmental issue. In other parts of the country, particularly in the West, which have a whole series of both federal and local, how should I put it, environmental issues, there are multiple commissions that get involved in this. And the Planning Commission is just one of an entire matrix that you have to get approval from. We're fairly simple. And as a practical matter, compared to other jurisdictions, which, and I don't know if I did it in this analysis, but that have an ocean as a border. When you look at jurisdictions that have an ocean as a border, both on the West Coast and the East Coast, and you look at our building code at the building code level for what is approved by a building inspector is incredibly liberal. It is, as many people have said, well, it's too restrictive. Our building code is incredibly liberal compared to those jurisdictions. It's absolutely stunning how liberal, and one could argue deficient, our building code actually is. that in many cases it has not at all kept up with the evolution of patterns that are occurring in the United States, to our own detriment in many cases. One of the issues that relates to that, and I know I may be going in different directions here at the moment, and I apologize, is we hear frequently people refer to the CDP in a justification, and especially applications that come before us. And the applicant will quote the CDP, and then members of the public will get up and quote the CDP that's polar opposite, saying, this is why you shouldn't do it. And the applicant says, this is why you should do it. Well, it turns out they're both using the CDP wrong. All of that documentation, after the first 2 pages where we state the objective of what the CDP is supposed to be, is supportive documentation. It can go one way or the other. But that one paragraph that talks about the sense of place of what Rehoboth Beach is, that is what the CDP is all about. That is the objective of what the other 200 and some pages says you want to try to achieve. Now that gets to be tough, because then it becomes interpretation. Does it really fit the CDP? Does it not fit the CDP? And that's what requires a community to evaluate it, because it changes over time. You've seen the evolution of that within Delaware. You can look at North Ocean City, look at Ocean City and look at the north end, and then look at the end that's near the inlet. 2 diametrically different ocean cities. You can look at other communities that have an ocean as a border. Carmel, California is probably the best analogy in terms of size compared to Rehoboth Beach. Their building code, the number of zones that they have, is so complex and so restrictive. But if you've ever been to Carmel, California, it is absolutely a phenomenal community. And they have maintained their sense of place. I've talked to the planners there. I've visited Carmel, California. It's amazing. Now, you can also go to the East Coast and look at some communities that have an ocean on their border. And if you look at the history of those communities, and some of you may not even realize what they were over the last 150 years, but just let me look at a couple of them here. Most people, at least on the East Coast, compare us somewhat to Cape May, New Jersey, to a great degree. Their building code is much more restrictive than ours, incredibly more restrictive. On the other hand, you have Atlantic City, New Jersey. I don't think anyone would want Rehoboth Beach to be Atlantic City. And if you go back 150 years and you look at the evolution of Atlantic City is a good example of a failed city. They lost their sense of place a long time ago. I happened to be on part of the research team when I was a college professor, where we were tasked for looking at the impact of gambling on Atlantic City. I can tell you that that task, which involved multiple universities in New Jersey, multiple analyses, and the data was conflicted. And the political environment was, well, this is going to rejuvenate Atlantic City. It's going to be the best thing that ever happened. All the money is going to stay here, all the jobs it's going to create. Everything that they said Atlantic City was going to become didn't happen. And in fact, Atlantic City had a peak for a while, then went back into decline and then reversed. One of the key things was, which was very interesting, is the fact that they said, well, this is going to rejuvenate the community because the money is going to stay within the community. Turns out that was one of the things that I was tasked with analyzing. Turns out the money didn't stay in the community. The majority of the money left and went to the outside developers and investors that put the buildings up. And most of the people that worked at those buildings did not live in Atlantic City. They lived outside of Atlantic City. The community itself was not really beneficially impacted. And now they're back to where they started again almost. One of the interesting things is Keansburg, New Jersey, which is, I think, a very instructive example. Probably most of you may have never heard of Keansburg, New Jersey. Keansburg, New Jersey is on the east side of north of Monmouth County. It sits right across from New York City. And in the late 1800s and in the very early 1900s, that was where all the people who were wealthy from New York City came to vacation. They came by ferry boat to Keansburg. Keansburg was the Rehoboth Beach of the late 1800s. It was a very affluent community. It was extremely successful. However, technology changes are what impacted them. There were two things. One is the Hudson River, where the confluence occurs with the Atlantic Ocean. And at that point in time, New York City used to dump their sewage directly into the Hudson, into the Hudson River, and it would flow out to the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, as the population of New York City increased, the sewage started to accumulate in the area. And so what happened is this beautiful, wonderful community started to go downhill because the beach could not be utilized. Now, also at this time, there was technology change. And suddenly you didn't take the ferry boat, you took this new thing called the automobile, or the bus, from New York City around over the bridge. And now you could get further down the coast and get away from the problems that used to be a very vibrant city. It's very interesting to note that Edison today, or Keansburg rather, today, still is a failed community. Over 100 years, over half the residents have financial issues, and a majority of the residents are on welfare. And yet at one time, it was this premier community, and due to circumstances they had no control over, they became a failed community. Now, others have been very successful. Ocean City, New Jersey, Cape May, New Jersey, Carmel by the Sea, California, Southampton, New York, Sag Harbor, New York. All of those are very successful communities because of their building code and their zoning restrictions, and having a planning commission who votes on those issues above a certain level. Again, I go back to say that our building code is extremely liberal with regard to the authority of the building inspector, and if that's what you wish to keep, terrific. On the other hand, when it exceeds those certain levels, it does really require a multidisciplinary approach, and it requires the fineness of a stiletto when you're analyzing, not a meat axe, which is essentially what the proposal that the commissioners put out there said, well, everything's going to be determined by the building inspector. That's a meat axe approach. That's not what you need if you really wish to maintain the ambiance of what Rehoboth Beach is, was, and is going to be. So I guess in summation, in looking at other communities, going back again to the statistics, the sense of place of what Delaware is and hopes to be and was is not served by taking the authority behind closed doors by a single individual, no matter who it is. I wouldn't care if today I was made the building inspector for Delaware or for Rehoboth Beach. I don't care the fact that I have significant credentials. I should not or should not, in that capacity, have the authority to approve things that have such dimensional considerations within the city that could be significantly detrimental. And that's really what this is all about, is preventing future harm within the city by accident, and why it takes a higher level of approvals by a multiplicity of people to make that decision. Whether it's consultants to us, consultants to the city, consultants to the building inspector, or the level of public participation so that you can make the most effective decision. One of the things and it's not really academic, but it's how things are analyzed from a decision-making standpoint, is we're dealing with unknowns here. None of us knows the future specifically. We may try to project it, estimate it as best we can, but we don't know exactly what's going to happen. What we don't want to do is do things in such a way that it sets us up for future potential disaster, for things that we haven't considered. And then we look at it when it occurs and says, oh my God, how did we ever allow that to happen? You decrease that probability by having a larger group of people, going back to the Delphi methodology again, of more involved decision-making. And as everyone's pointed out so far, that's the public participation piece that's so important. The fact that these 50, now there's only a couple people here of the public that's present. But whether it's 3 people or 100 people, someone's going to mention something that no one thought about. And we're all going to sit back and go, wow, we should consider that. That's what's so critical. Now, sometimes there's participation, and even by us, where we'll disagree among ourselves, where I'll make an observation, and my fellow commissioner would say, well, Mike, that's fine, but we disagree with you because, and we go evaluate it. It really ends up being an evaluative process from multiple perspectives so that you can come up with what's called the Pareto optimal. And basically, the bottom line, it means that a rising tide floats all boats higher. Just some boats are bigger than others, and that's a reality. That's what we're trying to do. We don't want to have anybody's boat sink. But that rising tide, we want to build everybody up, and that's the objective of what we're doing. The proposal that is currently was before, and I guess is now being still deliberated, although I don't know that, the proposal, in my opinion, is highly defective. Based on the research, I can say unequivocally, it's extremely bad, a terrible recommendation, and makes absolutely no sense and would be totally detrimental to the city if it was implemented. I'll be quiet now.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, sir. Have we all had an opportunity? Anyone from the public? Mr. Perry? Would you limit your comments to 3 minutes, please? Would you limit your comments to 3 minutes, please, sir?
We're not going to time it, though.
Yeah, we're running out of time.
I had to work.
We have more agenda items.
My name is Richard Perry, 46 Pennsylvania Avenue. Wow. Having 7 of you take all that time seriatim to explain a different aspect of the matter under consideration suggests to me that there was some non-public discussion taking place to well orchestrate what you just did.
I can tell you right now, I had no idea specifically what others were going to
So
say.
very obvious to
That's because,
anyone listening. I'm just saying that, that's my opinion.
okay,
I will also suggest that I believe that your notice of this meeting, based upon what just took place, was inadequate. It simply stated discussion about Chapter 270 and 236. Very clearly, this body had something else in mind, and it was the prosecution of your case, either to file an appeal of the Board of Adjustment decision in the Belhaven, or it was to establish your case to go to court. No one, and I'd also like to know why the city was not invited to
How do you know
attend.
that?
The building and licensing department.
How do you know that? How do you know they were not
I was
invited?
told by an individual that they were not
Well,
invited.
That
That is
conversation
false.
took place here yesterday, and they
Yesterday.
were
Yeah.
invited.
yeah.
We
that's
asked,
false.
we asked
Do you have
them to
anything
attend.
else of substance to add, sir?
Well, yes, I do. And I will say that I believe that a lot of the statements made here today by the various planning commissioners are totally inaccurate. They do not reflect the state of the law in Delaware. And you should be ashamed of yourselves for providing to the citizens who are out there watching this with that kind of demonstration. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I'd like to address Mr. Perry's comments.
Well, I'm not sure that it merits a response.
Well, I'm interested in hearing the other opinion because there's been a dearth of information coming to us about why this makes sense. But I will say under oath, I didn't coordinate with anybody. I've been telling anybody who will hear that this whole episode was a manufactured problem that dates back to the summer of 2022, 23. I may have told you that. And I think for me, I was frustrated by the mayor not giving us but 3 minutes to talk about the ordinances that appeared 3 days before the public hearing. And it was a time to be able to discuss our viewpoint that wasn't limited to, and constricted to that. But I would be interested in learning more about why you think it makes sense for the building inspector to have the authority, and then the follow-on question for that would be, what's the role of this body, or should it just be disbanded?
Maybe that should be submitted to us.
Yeah, that's
could be
not the
submitted.
discussion for today.
Yeah, that should
All
be
right, I'm
submitted.
sorry.
I didn't use my full 3 minutes. Could I just say something else?
If you bring something worthwhile before, sir, if you're just going to stand up and say bad things about us, I'm seriously not interested.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
I will say once again, as I did once before, I don't like having my comments, in essence, described as not having any value. That's improper and it's insulting.
Thank you, sir.
Well, I was going to respond to,
Go ahead.
30 seconds.
perhaps my response should be in writing so that everybody can
Yeah.
see it.
Yeah, that's what, that'd be great.
be
Because then, yeah.
And suffice it to say that I believe that at the very beginning of this whole process, the Planning Commission went to the Board of Commissioners with a comment to the effect that you were proposing your proposal because you didn't feel you had the authority. Now, that seems to be overlooked now. And I also don't know why anyone would suggest that the proposal that was put forth by the Board of Commissioners was not the city's response as they told you they were working on. It didn't come out of the blue. Those two proposals were, in my view, the city's response to yours and should have been treated as such. And the fact that you had only 3 minutes in front of the Board of Commissioners to comment, how is anyone sitting here today with no forewarning supposed to comment on an hour and 10 minutes of your comments in 3 minutes?
And there'll be another opportunity at the joint meeting in January.
Can I say something?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think a very specific response is my analytical analysis was in the public record on September 20th. It's the same analysis, so it's been out there for a month and a half. And it was in the minutes of the Board of Commissioner meeting. But I only had 3 minutes, and I wasn't allowed to discuss it in any detail, which I finally was able to do.
All right.
Anybody else?
Hearing no one else?
No, I just have to,
Oh, I'm sorry.
one thing is that I think the emotions here outweigh frankly, the clarity of what's at stake. There have been many assertions made, I'm not saying necessarily by you, Mr. Perry, at public meetings. One individual stood up and said, I don't know who the Planning Commission even reports to. They're out of control, okay? That was a really, shall I say, uninformed statement. There have also been other statements made that all these other communities they do it differently. Guess what? They don't. So Mr. Strange spent hours refuting that. And yet the misstatement was not footnoted, was not supported, was just picked up and repeated, and somehow became part of the public debate. So in addition to the fact that I think you've heard pretty much, if you've paid attention, and I know you have, Mr. Perry, to public statements the various ones of us have made, statements that have been put in the record, in some cases in writing, and Mr. Strange's case in writing, then I don't think that there wasn't sufficient notice. If you want to combine if you want to count up the airtime that's been taken by advocates for one of our applicants. I just find that, kind of an amazing criticism. But the particular point I want to make is, and this goes to what's in the public record, the memorandum that our former attorney prepared about why the Planning Commission, under current law, has the authority to reject the preliminary approval, quote unquote, of the building inspector. That was originally furnished to the city. And I might say it was not furnished to the Board of Commissioners until I sent it to the Board of Commissioners. So the Board of Commissioners, you say that the proposed legislation is the city's response. The members of the Board of Commission never saw that until 48 hours before the meeting. They had no idea what was going to be in that response. And then at the next meeting, they didn't see that until 48 hours before the meeting. So the idea that there's been this thoughtful, deliberative process that the Board of Commissioners has come up with these two proposals, simply not true. The Board of Commissioners has done nothing with those two proposals except to vote twice not to send them to public hearing. That's what's on the record for the city's response. All right, so, but the memorandum that our attorney prepared, sent to the city, who was then the city attorney, months ago, I sent that to each member of the Board of Commissioners after having conferred with the chair and the vice chair and our attorney that there was no objection to sending out a document marked privileged, attorney-client privilege. And I'm aware that Ms. Womack, in being very professional in her responsibility in terms of posting documents, declined to put that in the public record because the document was still marked attorney-client privilege. So since we are all here, I would just like to clarify for the record that we, being the clients, the Planning Commission being the clients, have no objection and in fact would like to put the memorandum from Mr. Mehta to Mr. Burns that was sent, I believe, in February of this year, that we would like to add that to the public record for this meeting so that it is finally officially in a public record. And I totally respect Ms. Womack for being cautious about that.
Do we need to vote on that?
I don't know. I didn't
I
know
mean,
that we did.
we're clients. We
yeah,
we have
and
the,
Luke
we
has
can
waived.
waive our
Yes, exactly.
attorney-client privilege.
Yes, I believe that
doesn't
waiver
waive,
has
the
taken
client
place,
does.
but if there is a concern, is there a motion to waive any?
It's already out
have any
there.
privilege
We've
that
already
we-
waived it.
Well,
We've given it to the Board of Commissioners.
No, but it's not in the public's.
Okay.
It's not in the public domain.
Can we vote on that, or do we have to?
Yes,
Okay.
vote on that.
So
Is there a motion to waive any privilege that might apply to this memorandum that Commissioner Hunter has referenced here today?
I so
Go ahead.
move.
I
Is there a
second.
Any discussion?
I think with an attorney-client privilege, once you publish the document to anybody, it's waived.
Right, but we're just confirming that the
So,
city
okay.
can publish it.
It's just
Okay.
confirming, and it's a courtesy to our city secretary.
Okay.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, privilege is waived.
Can I just make one final brief sort of closing statement? I just want to respond to the agenda item being general. I will point out that the very beginning of my presentation is about how we were tasked with providing, and some of the new code language is in 270, that's why that's referenced. Only the building inspector's part is in 270. The rest of what we've been tasked with was 236. I made specific reference to that at the beginning of my presentation as the whole sort of scope of the project we're working on. And the only reason we didn't get further with 236 is because the Board of Commissioners has gotten no further with 236. The whole thing got bypassed in favor of this one issue. So I think we meet the agenda.
All right. That concludes this item of new business. The next will be the discussion of the Belhaven project. And the statement on the agenda is the commission may go into executive session for a strategy session involving legal advice or opinion from the commission's attorney pursuant to 29 Delaware Code, Section 10004B4. You need I need a motion to go into executive session.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, we are in executive session.
Can I ask you, why be needed after the end of your session?
Don't know.
Stick around.
Don't know.
We will come back. We will come back here.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
will see you then.
Okay.
Are we recording?
There we are, okay.
All right. Having concluded the executive session as set forth on the agenda today, is there a motion to come out of executive session and go back into open session?
So moved.
Is there a
Second.
second? Second. Any discussion? Roll call vote, please, Mr. Secretary.
Okay. Commissioner Stockdale is absent. Commissioner Ellison?
Yes.
Commissioner Davis is absent. Commissioner Stewart?
Yes.
Commissioner Strange?
Yes.
Commissioner Hunter?
Yes.
Myself, Commissioner Dewey, yes. Commissioner Gay?
Aye.
And Commissioner Bryan?
Yes. So we are back into open session, and there being no further items on the agenda, we are adjourned
At 4:12,
at 4:12.
or 4:11, maybe.
Yeah.
Is that like when you doctor